So again, I plan to speak for 35, 40 minutes, hopefully, but I know coming from an interdisciplinary audience that sometimes we make assumptions about kind of knowledge that people have, so please feel free to interrupt me with clarifying moments. I would hate for those to linger. So this is work that's in progress, so I really appreciate you coming today and the opportunity to get some feedback from a diverse set of scholars. What I hope to show you is that federal housing policy designed to segregate was actually quite effective in doing so. Specifically, that cities that were redlined by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and I'll describe that policy in a little bit, in the 1930s became far more segregated in the subsequent decades and basically remained that way. And for decades, numerous scholars have been pointing to New Deal era housing policies as shaping segregation patterns that we see today, but we still, to this point, have no kind of empirical evidence of the magnitude of that change, which is somewhat surprising. So I'd like to start with this excerpt from Price and Crowder's 2017 Cycle of Segregation book. And this is literally from the first page of their book. And this is a quote from then Senator Edward Brooke of Massachusetts, a proponent of the Fair Housing Act, and in which he's saying, we're making two general assertions. The first, that American cities are suffering from galloping segregation, a malady so widespread and deeply embedded in the national psyche that many Americans, Negroes as well as whites, have come to regard it as a natural condition. And two, that the prime carrier of galloping segregation has been the federal government. And so this is, perhaps outdated metaphor of galloping segregation, but I really appreciate this quote because it's making two pretty contrasting points. The first, that segregation is so ingrained and normalized that we assume it to be natural. And despite this common understanding about segregation's origins, the federal government is deeply implicated in what we see. And today's talk again is going to focus on one specific policy, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and ask if appraisals of cities made by that policy led to increased segregation compared to unappraised cities. So I'm going to describe HOLC, or HOLC, over the next couple of slides, and then go into the current study in which I merge archival and contemporary data sets, and then go through my analytical strategy and results before, and again, kind of engaging in conversation with you. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation was passed in 1933. It was intended to provide short-term relief to a housing market that was really in severe crisis. We tend to consider the Great Depression as an employment crisis, and it certainly was, but it was also an enormous housing crisis. About half of mortgage debt was in default at the passage of HOLC. It allowed for homeowners who were at risk of foreclosure to refinance their mortgages to avoid foreclosure, and it also provided funds for individuals who had previously lost their homes to foreclosure to buy back their homes. It granted $3 billion of loans in its first 2 years in 1933 dollars, so this is quite a bit. The scope of HOLC was quite substantial. It touched 1 in every 10 non-farm homes in America. Even though HOLC was intended to be short-term by design, it had two enormous long-term consequences. And the first of which was that it effectively created the American homeownership society through the institutionalization of the long-term standard payment mortgage. And it's worth pausing to emphasize how important this change was. Prior to HOLC, there was no kind of standardized mortgage credit. If you were wealthy, you would buy homes with cash, or you would put down kind of 50% down payments, and you were otherwise reliant on what Robert Fishman describes as kind of patchwork mortgage system. So not only did HOLC kind of save this industry that was in distress, but it established the primary tool for wealth generation for most Americans. Wealth that can appreciate over time, be tapped in times of distress and used for intergenerational and intragenerational mobility, such as investments in college, entrepreneurship, and additional subsequent homeownership. And this is in large part why the racist design and implementation and inheritance of HOLC are so important to study. And that's the kind of second long-term impact, the one that today's talk focuses on, and is that on segregation via the process of redlining. And I'm going to describe what that practice is for those who don't know over the next couple of slides. Ken Jackson's Crabgrass Frontier in the mid-1980s wrote extensively about this practice. So redlining refers to the denial of mortgage credit to communities of color. So HOLC asked appraisers to go around to hundreds of cities around the country and grade neighborhoods based on their creditworthiness. And neighborhoods were given one of four grades, A being the highest grades, B, C, D being the lowest grades. And the grades were color-coded, D grades were red, and this is where the term redlining came from. And this is a map, they were called residential security maps of Atlanta, and this largely typifies the kind of geographic distribution of grades, where kind of downtown and urban areas, typically home to the poor, people of color, immigrants, were given the lowest grades, and the A grades and B grades were largely reserved for wealthier white suburbs. So the grades were based on a number of different things. Appraisers took into account the conditions of the neighborhood, the quality of the housing stock, economic activity, and race was a huge, huge factor in determining what your grade. So in addition to just a simple A through D grade, appraisers also provided a rich description of every single neighborhood that they appraised. So here is an excerpt that I apologize is going to be a little bit difficult to read from this neighborhood down here. I'm also going to show one from this A neighborhood up here. This excerpt here is about a quarter or a fifth of the appraisal for this neighborhood. And so each appraisal includes a description of the terrain and then a list of favorable and detrimental influences. And under detrimental influences for this neighborhood, we have income instability, mixture of racial groups, juvenile delinquency, infant mortality, crime, vandalism, etc. And then next is listed the number of, or the inhabitants of that neighborhood. So we have 10% foreign-born families from Syria, Greece, Italy, and Jews. The wrong kinds of foreign-born families. And then 40% Negro families. There were very many relief families. This is kind of early versions of welfare. And infiltration was the term that they used to describe racial change. And since this community already had a large immigrant and black population, there was low levels of, or low risk of infiltration. This neighborhood had already been infiltrated. And it's worth noting that, again, Negro is the only racial category listed on this form. Nathan Conley and Ken Jackson and others who have conducted deeper analyses of these appraisal narratives have documented preoccupation, if not obsession, among appraisers with the presence of African Americans. Often a single black person living in a neighborhood would guarantee it a D grade. So here's a comparative excerpt from an A neighborhood in the northwest quadrant of that map. The only mention of people of color on this appraisal or under detrimental influences is the difficulty of transporting Negro servants to this neighborhood. No foreign-born families, no Negroes, no risk of infiltration, and no relief families here.
This is 1933.
This map was made in 1938. So most of the maps were made in 1937, 38, and 38. Yeah. one pretty famous kind of micro example of the consequences of redlining is Detroit's 8 Mile Wall. So this wall was constructed because a white neighborhood that was too close to a black neighborhood and therefore was at risk of infiltration. So they built this wall ostensibly to block African Americans from infiltrating their neighborhood. They were then subsequently allowed to receive mortgage assistance. The black neighborhood obviously was not. And there are other examples from throughout the country, in places like Atlanta and Miami, where communities, real estate speculators, and municipalities would build these walls to protect themselves, again, from infiltration and therefore kind of risk of this credit downgrading. And part of this wall still exists today in what has become arguably the most, or certainly one of the most, I won't put a point on that with John in the room, but most segregated cities and metro areas in the entire country. And so this is a map that, I can apologize because of the contrast, it's a little bit difficult to see, but it shows black residents as green dots and white residents as blue dots. And I challenge you to find a kind of starker racial boundary across the metropolitan area. And again, parts of that wall still exist today. So my research question is to connect the patterns of this historic process to contemporary patterns of racial segregation. And this is building on work by Dan Aronson, Dan Hartley, and Bosch Mazumdar at the Federal Reserve of Chicago, showing that grades were important drivers of kind of neighborhood level racial characteristics, as well as some work of my own that's in process right now, showing that the places, the kind of neighborhoods that were redlined in the 30s and 40s and 50s still face forms of redlining today. So you may be thinking, HOLC was a very long time ago. Kind of how does this fit within kind of other historical processes? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that without this, again, turning into a lecture about the history of American housing policy. The Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, and the GI Bill inherited HOLC's redlining practices and also expanded the segregation of mortgage credit through restrictive covenants, funneling billions of dollars away from poor urban communities of color and towards white suburbs. By 1972, FHA helped 11 million households buy homes, and homeownership went from about 44% in 1930 to about 2/3 in 1970. And fewer than 1% of these loans went to African Americans. And just as homeownership opportunities were opening up for white Americans, we were building segregated public housing units and using highways to segregate neighborhoods and connect white suburban bedroom communities to job centers, displacing hundreds of thousands of disproportionately people of color through urban renewal, the process of urban renewal, which James Baldwin famously renamed Negro removal. This conflation of race and lending risk constrained housing options for African Americans, creating opportunities for exploitation through practices such as blockbusting. Private lenders also adopted redlining practices of these federal policies, and many scholars position this as an extension of Jim Crow, as well as more contemporary mortgage lending. It's of course important to note that the Homeowners Loan Corporation didn't invent the practice of redlining, and it didn't invent racism in real estate, of course, but it's institutionalized it and scaled it up with the power of the federal government. So it set these and other processes in motion. This was recently investigated by Richard Rothstein, but there's a long research record dating back at least to the 1980s and Ken Jackson. So my analytical strategy is fairly straightforward and is designed in pursuit of a rather simple task: exploring differences in the change over time in segregation between cities and towns and census places that were appraised by HOLC and those that were not, or kind of ignored by HOLC. My primary concern is black-white segregation, and there are a number of reasons for this. Again, HOLC appraisals were particularly concerned with the presence of African Americans. The black-white color line has been and continues to be stronger than other racial boundaries, especially when it comes to neighborhood attainment. And data consistency is also a limit here. That U.S. Census kind of categorizations of Asians and Latinos has varied a lot more than its categorization of blacks and whites. Part of the one manifestation of this is that I don't have tract level data on Latinos for 1950 or 1960. So my ideal data set would include longitudinal measures of race, socioeconomic status, housing conditions, for geographically stable neighborhoods and cities from before HOLC all the way up until today. Of course, unfortunately, those don't exist. So I'm reliant on imperfect measures of changing racial geography gathered from multiple census data sources, and I'll go into detail of those in a couple slides. So here's a map kind of showing HOLC's reach. So this is from the Mapping Inequality website. This research group very generously spent who knows how much time and money georeferencing, going into the archives and georeferencing every HOLC redlining map that they could find. This gives you a sense of the geographic coverage of HOLC, not surprising given kind of the population distribution at the time. There's a lot of over-concentration in the Northeast, and the Rust Belt kind of less good coverage as you go west. So my primary data come from this website, from which you can download the original map. So here's the map, several maps put together for Chicago. You can download just the graded areas or cleaner versions of polygons for the graded areas, kind of georeferenced in this way. So I supplement the mapping inequality data with information from a paper by Amy Hillier, who studied HOLC surveyed cities. The lists almost completely overlap. The cities defined that are identified by mapping inequality, but not on Hillier's list, are largely due to spillover from county-wide and metro-wide appraisals that I'm going to describe again in a few slides. It's a bit more ambiguous why there are some cities that are on the Hillier list and not in the mapping inequality list. I unfortunately did find some typos in the Hillier list, but the important thing is that the results are completely indifferent to whichever measure you use. If you use one or the other, I'm going to use both. So I use the term appraised or graded or surveyed to refer to 2012 census places that at least partially overlap with residential security map graded areas, or if they're on the Hillier list. And this is in contrast to ungraded, ignored, unappraised, or non-appraised places. This technique prioritizes parsimony, which may come at the expense of a more nuanced understanding of HOLC processes. For example, again, I'm treating cities that only partially overlapped with the redlining maps, the same as those that were completely overlapped by redlining maps. I looked into various different operationalizations of HOLC redlining, such as the kind of percentage of a city that was covered by a map, or the percentage of a city that got specific grades. And it's kind of surprisingly, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, those were poor predictors of future segregation. And again, that was kind of surprising to me, but perhaps suggestive of an institutional practice or process that just being appraised or being touched by an appraisal was the effect here, that this is a kind of city-level phenomenon. So as I mentioned before, I have kind of imperfect demographic data. So I start with the full count data census data from 1920 and 1940. Unfortunately, I only have the 5% sample from 1930. For some reason, IPUMS doesn't have neighborhood level. It doesn't have neighborhood level IDs for the full sample of 1930, and they've told me that they have no plans to add that. So I only have the 5% sample here. The city and town name is included in the data set for the IPUMS data. Unfortunately, full count data are not available for later years, so I use National Historic GIS data on the tract level for 1950 and 1960, and then the neighborhood change database tract level data for 1970 forward. And city and town are not included in these data sets, so I identify place by spatial join for these years. I use the three most commonly used measures of segregation, the isolation index, which identifies the kind of typical neighborhood percent black for African Americans within a city, the dissimilarity index, which estimates the percent of blacks or whites that would need to change neighborhoods in order for there to be an even distribution within a city, and then the information theory index, which measures unevenness of the black population. So tracts didn't exist in many cities before 1950, so I have to use wards for these earlier census years. Again, importantly, results hold if I use enumeration districts, which are even smaller geographies for these earlier years as definitions of neighborhoods, or if I use data from this 1999 Cutler, Glazer, and Vigdor piece, the rise and decline of the American ghetto for pre-1950 years. Again, the findings are kind of insensitive across all of these different ways of measuring segregation. So some models that I'm going to show you include measures of segregation's covariates, and I run into another kind of data consistency problem here. I need variables that are reliably collected every 10 years by the census for a century, and so I'm kind of limited to population size, percent black, percent foreign born, unemployment rate, and then as a kind of proxy of the black-white wealth gap, the ratio of black to white homeownership. But again, I'm kind of limited by the 1950 and 60 censuses that they don't have black homeownership. They only have white and non-white homeownership for those years. Cities and towns are in my analytical sample if they meet several criteria. So they need to have a black population of at least 100 in the observed year. There needs to be at least 2 census tracts or wards, so there needs to actually be, segregation actually needs to be measurable. The place year must have full covariate information, and it has to be observed kind of pre-HOLC, so either in 1920 or 1930, and at least once after 1930. So the total number of observations that I have is an unbalanced panel of 4,360 place years. Importantly, the results are stronger within a larger sample that isn't restricted by these criteria, and the results are also, they're a little bit weaker, but they also hold when I restrict the sample to a fully balanced sample where every city is observed every single year and has covariates every single year, meets these criteria every single year. So my estimation strategy is a difference in differences, the most basic version of which is here, kind of measuring segregation as a function of whether or not a city was graded by HOLC, a dummy variable for the post-HOLC time period, so 1940 and later, and then an interaction between the two. And the intuition behind this modeling strategy is that it allows me to estimate differences in the before to after change in segregation between graded and ungraded cities. And my focus is on this tau, this coefficient on the interaction, the DID estimator. There are 4 primary specifications that I'm going to show you. One that adds pre-HOLC controls to this model, the second that adds time-varying sociodemographic characteristics, then I add city fixed effects with and without, or without and with time-varying covariates. All models include division by year, time trends, and standard errors clustered at the place level. So I want to flag a really important endogeneity concern that many of you have been thinking about, I'm sure, which is that HOLC assignment was non-random. So the guidelines requested maps for all cities that had a population of at least 40,000 at the time of implementation. However, there are several residential security maps that extended well beyond municipal borders. So the mapping inequality data set shows data such as these two. There are many appraisals for that were ostensibly just part of one city but spilled past those boundaries, or included nearby suburbs, and there were 7 kind of county-wide appraisals, such as this one for Lower Westchester County in New York, and Essex County in New Jersey, these kind of suburban counties right outside New York City. And each one of these counties includes many municipalities. And because of this, there were many cities that were below the 40,000 cutoff that ended up being appraised by HOLC. In total, there were 118 appraised cities that had populations in 1930 below 40,000. There were also 31 unappraised cities above the 40,000 mark. It's unclear why those cities were not appraised. The largest ungraded city was Elizabeth, New Jersey, which had a population of almost 115,000. The smallest graded city was LaGrange, Illinois, which had a population just over 10,000. And again, it's possible that I have false negatives in here, that the maps are simply lost to history, that the archives didn't persist, but can't really do much about that. So I take advantage of this imperfect implementation to hopefully address this endogeneity concern through 2 different approaches, one that I call the inside-out approach and the other that I call the outside-in approach. So the inside-out approach estimates the effect of HOLC on progressively larger samples of cities right around the population cutoff. So I start with cities that are within 1/10 of a standard deviation of the distribution of population, plus or minus 40,000, 2/10, 3/10, et cetera, up to 1 standard deviation. And then the outside-in approach takes progressively smaller samples of cities between the nth smallest graded city and nth largest ungraded city, and then comes in from there. And when I show these results, I'll explain them again. So on to some results. So this slide is going to show kind of average levels of black isolation for cities that were appraised by HOLC in red and then ignored in blue. You can see that in the 2 decades prior, there was effectively no difference. If anything, cities that would go on to be appraised were less segregated on this measure than cities that were going to go on to be ignored. In 1940, again, this is kind of right after, just a year or 2 or 3 after these maps were made, basically no difference. And then in 1950 and 1960, these are the noisiest years because of data limitations, but we see this huge jump in appraised cities. And then now that we're in the neighborhood change database with geographically stable census tracts, we see that this gap basically never closes. Even unappraised cities got more segregated in the middle of the last century, but this gap, the appraised cities got way more segregated during this time period. There are slightly different but complementary distributions over time when looking at dissimilarity. the information theory indices, that prior to Homeowners Loan Corporation, there were only significant differences in the dissimilarity index. But again, this huge gap emerges kind of exactly when you would expect it to. So when HOLC and then FHA and the GI Bill are all kicking in, and suburbanization is really ramping up, and then the effects kind of get locked in place in somewhere in the 60s and 70s, and then even though kind of both measures are declining, again the gap between appraised and unappraised cities does not budge. Another way of kind of looking at this change over time, and if you have, is to look at the distributions of each of these three measures. And this is especially important if you're concerned about kind of overlap between these two samples. And so these are the distributions of dissimilarity, isolation, and information theory index for appraised and unappraised cities in 1930. You can see that the distributions of all three of these measures are almost identical before the policy was implemented. And here is 2010. And it may be a little bit hard to see because of the contrast, but the distributions are now kind of quite different than they were before treatment. So the next few slides are going to show results from the difference in differences estimates through a series of coefficient plots with 95% confidence intervals for various specifications. And again, I'm focusing on the DID estimator, this coefficient on the interaction between whether or not you were graded and the post-treatment dummy variable. And all models include division by year fixed effects and standard errors that are clustered at the place. So starting with black isolation, the first coefficient is from a model that has just the pre-treatment 1930 covariates. The second one adds time-varying covariates, then place fixed effects with no covariates, place fixed effects with time-varying covariates. So on average, the difference between appraised and unappraised cities was between 5 and 14 points higher in the decades after 1930. White-black dissimilarity was also on average higher in all of these models. The time-varying controls had less of a dampening impact when it comes to the estimate of dissimilarity here. So on average, these appraised cities were between 6 and 9 points higher. And information theory index were fairly similar. So on average, between 7 and 10 points higher. So across all three of these measures, we see pretty large differences between appraised and unappraised cities. And it's worth pausing to think about what these coefficients actually mean in terms of kind of magnitude. So highlighting the dissimilarity index for a moment. Dissimilarity in my sample peaked in 1950 at about 0.65 and had dropped in 2010 to about 0.37 on, 0.28 on average. And so this is about a 0.37 change, or a 37-point change. So my preferred point estimate is the fixed effects with no time-varying controls, which predicts about a 9-point difference between appraised and unappraised cities. So this 9-point difference, the magnitude of this 9-point difference is about a quarter of this 60-year decline in dissimilarity. So a pretty big effect, if you believe the causal effect. So now moving on to models that are exploiting imperfections in implementation by doing the kind of inside out and outside in. So starting with the inside out, I'm going to show coefficient plots from models using just city fixed effects, division specific time trends, and no time varying covariates. And so here are DID estimators for 10 samples for black isolation. So within the smallest sample here, so this is within 1/10 of a standard deviation of the population distribution, around 40,000, I get a positive but imprecise estimate. And that sample is only 671 place years, so not a lot of statistical power there. But then I get significant and pretty stable estimates starting at 0.2 of a standard deviation, which is a sample of around 1,600 place years. And note that the smallest city in the sample hits at about 0.4 of a standard deviation, so I'm only pulling in larger cities at that point, and it still kind of remains stable. There are identical patterns when looking at dissimilarity and information theory indices. So again, kind of significant and stable patterns starting at 0.2 of a standard deviation. Now, quickly going to the outside-in strategy. So I'm starting with the first sample is all cities with populations between the smallest graded city and the largest ungraded city, and then second smallest ungraded, second smallest graded, second largest ungraded, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and the model estimates are fairly stable across all of these samples, and again, kind of almost identical patterns in the other two measures of segregation. So I'm kind of running out of time here, but we'll quickly go through a number of important limitations to this study that I hope we can kind of talk more about. The most important one, again, is this, the fact that HOLC was not randomly assigned. So I'm hopeful that this kind of modeling of the imperfect implementation of this policy around the cutoff shows that estimates hold within these samples of cities that could have been appraised. My reliance on different census data is also really important to flag. Again, the results hold if I use different segregation measures before 1950 or exclude 1950 and 60, these noisiest years. But kind of thinking about confounding here for kind of changing tract boundaries to threaten my findings, this kind of segregation bias and tract boundary definitions would have to be correlated with HOLC appraisal, kind of net of city fixed effects and time varying controls and pretreatment controls in some samples as well. So this is certainly possible, but I think it's far more likely that a policy that was designed to segregate did quite a good job at doing so. The specific mechanisms through which HOLC led to increased segregation are kind of still worth looking deeply into. I have some estimates that I don't love that show that there was some effect on inter-city migration. Again, there's this Dan Aronson et al. Paper showing that intra-city migration probably also is affected by HOLC. My guess is that both of these things are happening at the same time. I am unable to measure the effects of HOLC on larger geographies through my focus on cities. So the effect of HOLC on metro areas, for example. So processes of white flight and suburbanization are not well captured here, in part because many of these municipalities didn't exist before HOLC was implemented. So they're not in the analytical sample. And my assumption is that this sampling restriction downwardly biases the results that I've shown here. Again, I find stronger relationships when I loosen sampling restrictions. So to conclude, HOLC appraisals likely led to increased and fairly stable gaps in segregation. They have not changed in about half a century. And there are, of course, many broader consequences that we can consider in this realm. Material consequences such as wealth accumulation, access to educational opportunities, mobility, etc., as well as cultural consequences. David Roediger argues that the consolidation of the contemporary white identity was in large part facilitated through suburbanization that was funded by HOLC, FHA, and the GI Bill. And as I've had and talked in many conversations this morning and last night, there's a political relevance to these results as well, that we're now, surprisingly and encouragingly, in a place where we can openly talk about the implications and culpability of federal action to increase segregation and racial inequality. So undoing almost a century's worth of damage will likely require a substantial effort and investment, but with specifically anti-racist intent. The segregationist legacy of new housing policies serve an even larger racial project by endorsing the idea that racism is a tool with which white Americans can build equity over time. The HOLC and the larger federal policies that adopted these practices, the FHA and the GI Bill, not only encouraged and institutionalized racist ideas about black people and black places, but heavily invested in them, thereby ensuring that inherited inequality remains one of the most powerful structural determinants of racial stratification decades later and generations later. So kind of a minute over time, but thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions.
Please take questions, but while we get a cue, I wondered if you could speak with us a bit more about where do we go from here?
Well, as I asked earlier, do you have a time machine? I think that there's hope and despair in these results. I mean, I think that it's daunting to think about the task necessary to undo this massive intervention in the housing market. But we know that policy created this racial geography, so in some ways we kind of know that policy can undo it. The specific pathways to that are kind of ambiguous to me at this point, but happy to hear.
Eric has those answers.
Yes.
Yeah. I do not. So thank you for a great talk. I'm wondering if you have explored any empirical linkages between the housing patterns you have found and broader policy consequences, such as the drawing of political boundaries, the location of schools in its districts, the location of hospitals, road building. Can you connect these patterns more systematically to segregation patterns in other parts of the policy space?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I hope to. One of the things that I'm going to be looking at is kind of using this same identification strategy to estimate the effect of redlining on political affiliation and of post-civil rights, this turning point. But it would be really interesting to draw connections between this boundary making at this one really crucial point in history and congressional redistricting more contemporaneously. Highways, we know that the FHA manuals encouraged city planners to build highways to segregate neighborhoods. So that story would probably also bear out. I mean, the other kind of big thing that I would love to look into is, thinking of highways, is urban renewal, which often kind of targeted some redlined and yellow-lined neighborhoods.
Yeah. So, wonderful talk. I mean, I'm totally convinced by the yours. But I'm curious if you would, talk a bit or speculate a bit about the mechanisms, and particularly, it seems to me from the little bit that I can read at this distance from the forms, that in some sense the forms were intended to implement something like the criteria that lenders would have been using anyhow, right? And so, presumably in the non-FHA or HOLC appraised cities, people were still giving or not giving loans, quite possibly on similar racialized bases, right? And so, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why that process of appraisal led to this very long tail of segregation, given that, you can tell me that I'm wrong, but my assumption is the underlying psychology the day before the HOLC
Yeah.
appraisal didn't differ much between those communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly right. Again, that HOLC didn't invent these practices. You know, what it did was, and followed by the GI Bill and the larger federal policies, was funnel billions of dollars into this practice in specific places. So if you think back to the change over time, you know, unappraised places also kind of got more segregated during this time period. You know, to your point that, you know, real estate markets were also kind of already operating in this way. I think that the kind of institutionalization of these practices and the kind of legitimizing effect of the kind of federal government kind of gave additional kind of sway on the local level for this. The other mechanism, or there are many mechanisms. So I mentioned kind of intercity migration. It's possible. It seems like there's like some evidence that places that were appraised by HOLC saw increases in black populations, so that could be driving it. Again, there's this paper of these economists showing that the boundary making increased neighborhood level racial isolation, and they actually interestingly show that that redlining wasn't as strong an effect as yellow lining was. That perhaps there was way more discretion in giving out C grades than there was giving. Everybody knew what a D grade, what a D neighborhood was or looked like. But C, there was this, you know, you could be on either side of a B or a C, and by giving a neighborhood a C, it increased black population over time. Nathan Conley, who has dove deep into the appraisals in Miami, and so like again, the excerpts that I showed were very small excerpts. There were these kind of criteria that all the appraisals include, and then there are narratives for each neighborhood too. So there are, you know, dozens of dissertations to be written using these now public data. An interesting finding from his work is that there is or was very little heterogeneity in among A neighborhoods. A neighborhoods were pretty much the same everywhere, but D neighborhoods varied a little bit city to city. It could be that there are Italians living there and some African Americans living there and poor families. It could be that you're close to industry. It could be that you were kind of abutting a swamp. It could also have been, since many of these maps were made kind of in coordination with local real estate interests, that D neighborhoods, or the labeling of a neighborhood as D was used by real estate speculators for profit. That if you got a D grade, then if you were living in a neighborhood that got a D grade, you were less likely to get this mortgage assistance, and then therefore more likely to foreclose, and then a real estate speculator could buy the land, and so there's a housing stock change mechanism as well that is fairly complicated.
So I think Tony has a two-finger, and then we'll go to Andrew.
Yeah, I want to push you on this a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Us take the results as being what they are, but you could think of this as, I mean, what I'm asking is how you think about the initial intervention. Is it specifically racialized, or is it the codification of existing practices? And then, if it's the codification of existing practices on appraisals of credit risk, then there's an argument that said, well, the market ended up doing better being non-racialized than the categorization, than the codification of risk made by the state. And this is a really strong reason not to support government intervention at all.
Right. Yeah. I don't know how to disentangle those two phenomena, right? I mean, I think that they're so intertwined. So I'm going to engage more with the second piece, right? And that's what like that Ben Carson 2015 Washington Times op-ed was, right? Like, the government has done social engineering before. It invested in redlining and created segregated neighborhoods, and he was right until the end of that sentence, where he then kind of pivoted and said, therefore the government should never get involved. And I think there's a counterfactual history in which people were not discouraged from integrating. So, I've largely talked about this practice as harming African Americans, but it also harmed whites who were living in integrated neighborhoods, right? So again, there's a counterfactual history in which integrated neighborhoods were not punished for integration, and then because they were not punished, that created kind of more stable integration. But kind of moving forward, how we remedy this without exacerbating it is a difficult question.
So I guess a two-part question around understanding that treatment assignment for the appraisals.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the first part is, so not knowing the implementation, why was 40,000 chosen as the population cutoff? Because is it a neutral kind of benchmark based on just where census statistics were, or is it akin to the 1924, I think, Immigration Act, where it's an apparently arbitrarily chosen year, but it's chosen with intentions based on, okay, we can get certain population characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
So is 40,000 arbitrary, or is there other stuff in there?
Yeah.
And then the second point is I like trying to think about these kind of misassignments between cities not counted that should have been, and then addressing pulling in the cities that were enumerated and shouldn't have been. Do you have any descriptives that suggest that these are observationally similar? Because one of the things I was wondering is even socioeconomic or other racial composition looks similar. It could just be that these larger population cities are also internal migration receiving country, receiving cities. So this codification of existing practice, the reason you get segregation increasing is that you're also getting internal migration of African Americans from the South, Latinos moving across the West, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I guess 2 parts, pick whatever.
Yeah. The great questions. The 40,000, I don't have an answer to that. I don't know. I don't know why that was the rule. But your latter point is really good. It would be great to as a first cut look at those distributions within each of those kind of subsamples that I'm relying on, especially that kind of maybe that smallest one, like the first one where I see a significant coefficient, and then also I can leverage the pre-HOLC full count data to look kind of pretty closely at a wide range of covariate differences. So that would be really great. If you could articulate the sending receiving part of that question one more time.
So I was just thinking within the US, as in terms of migration patterns.
Yeah.
So it could be that you have a city that just trying to think of other characteristics. So a lot of movement of African Americans from the South to Chicago.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
Trying to think maybe one of the the reasons you're getting a large segregation treatment effect is that one of the you have a city that is enumerated but also happens to be receiving a lot of people that are subject to that policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I don't know if that necessarily fits within the story, or it just
yeah. Well, that's what this suggests. Yeah. But is that disentangling HOLC as a pull from HOLC as a sorter within is hard, right? Or it doesn't seem like there's a push, like HOLC is pushing white people out, but
Yeah, maybe like if that's a way to kind of clarify what work the HOLC is doing, if it's codifying existing practice,
Right.
or because like, if you have a city that has a little bit more heterogeneity in terms of how mortgages are given out, then even if it's receiving a lot of people that would be subject to it.
yeah, that's great. Thanks.
We'll move from Andrew Engelhardt to Andrew Schrank.
Thanks. This is great and incredibly thought-provoking. Two thoughts that come to me. One is, if I go back to the early 20th century sociological literature on cities, all the way up through Burgess and Park and that work, it's not painting a picture of integration. It's painting a picture where there's already a lot of segregation. I'm wondering how you square those two things. The second question is, if I think about more recent work like Massey and Denton, they have this finding, if I remember correctly, that cities tend not to segregate until the African American population hits 5%. And then there's a tipping phenomenon. And most of the cities that are below 5% are in that area in your map that weren't graded by the HOLC. They're in the Mountain West, they're in the Upper Midwest, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a selection phenomenon there where your HOLC cities are above that tipping phenomenon? Which I think actually gets back to the prior question about the Great Migration and things like that.
Yeah. So for your second question, I looked at different black population cutoffs, but maybe I should have done this as population share rather than pure population size. Because within the full sample, there's it seems to hold regardless, and then within the restricted sample, these samples are really small, but it still seems to be there. The kind of history of urban sociology's pictures of cities, I think there's somewhat of a disjuncture that's connected to the prior question about migration, where Chicago or New York, in African Americans in Chicago or New York in 1920 or 1930 were quite segregated, and then you see an increase in black population in those places as well. So again, kind of thinking about this kind of inter and intra-city migration both as possible mechanisms. I also, it's been a while since I've read that work, wonder, my memory of that is that a lot of the segregation that was described was along class and immigration lines as well. But I could be happily corrected. And I know that these maps were kind of driven by Chicago school kind of understandings of city suburb distribution of worth. So,
Marco?
Oh, yes. Thank you. It's really interesting. I am curious to hear you say a little bit more about some of the larger scale social and political changes that were also taking place during, or slightly after, I guess, this time. And I'm thinking especially of some of the desegregation efforts related to the civil rights movement. And even though those, I was trying to get my timeline straight while you were talking in my head, right? But even though some of those kind of initiatives like desegregation of schools or desegregation of public spaces took place for the period that you're observing, it seems like they could be potentially relevant for especially understanding the persistence, right, of some of the patterns that you're seeing. So I'm just curious to hear how you think some of those policies may actually play into what you're seeing.
yeah, I think that there are a couple of important historical points here. The first is that those proactive efforts to integrate were not about housing or neighborhoods, right? So that's one perhaps reason why we wouldn't see this. Schooling integration was about busing. And the kind of civil rights victories around housing were, looking back on them, not nearly as effective as they could have been. The biggest consequence of those laws was that you couldn't discriminate explicitly anymore. And so we've seen, declines in explicit and implicit discrimination in the housing market. But there's a kind of lingering question about kind of whether discrimination is the biggest driver of segregation today or 50 years ago. And I think most segregation scholars would say it's not, that this kind of intergenerational inequality in neighborhood attainment, in wealth, in geography are kind of much bigger drivers. And so, if you today eliminated racial animus in all of America, you would still have segregation persisting over time. And so this is kind of a limitation of the civil rights era this way.
Next we have Ben.
So I really like the presentation, particularly the data. It makes for a great research agenda. I don't know where you're going next with this, but I'm wondering, one possibility could be looking within the treated cities, right, within the appraised cities, and seeing what kind of heterogeneity is there? Are they following the same course? Do you have some kind of cities that are particularly heavily treated and others that are kind of almost immune to the effect? And that would be interesting because it gets to part of Susan's question, where do we go from here?
Yeah.
You might understand the characteristics of how a city might resist the effects of appraisal, also helps you think about mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
And then an additional data set you want to bring in this period you're studying, there's huge economic transformation in the cities, right? There's deindustrialization in populated cities, there's the changing location of manufacturing, and there's great census manufacturers data that can give you what's happening in manufacturing, and B, how wages are changing over the time period you're studying. So you can see cities changing in wealth in a major sector.
No, that's a great suggestion, and actually it's a mechanism that I hadn't thought of before, but a really interesting one in that, as you said, like depending on which historian you believe, deindustrialization and the deindustrialization of the country as a whole, as well as the kind of migration of manufacturing jobs from cities to suburbs, started in and around this time and basically continued through the entire period. So, that timing with the kind of financial incentive via homeownership subsidy for whites to follow those whatever jobs were leaving could help explain the stability of this. If you're at the same time locking in the geography of people by race, you're also locking in the geography of wage attainment by race. That would be a really interesting thing to look at as well. Thanks for that.
Thank you. I like this talk a lot. It was really convincing, and I'm not going to be a stickler or anything like that. This is more about the scope, because the title was Consequences of New Deal Era Intervention in America's Racial Geography. So the first part about the history, and the second part is looking ahead, and if you just want to just say, I don't want to talk about this thing, that's fine. So on the history, what were some of the other New Deal interventions that may have affected American social geography? That is, just even specifically in the housing sector, public housing. Rent control, were there other things? I know FDR actually supported a human right, or the second Bill of Rights that included a right to decent housing, which is a fairly radical idea these days. And that gets to me the second point of my question, and I guess jobs initiatives and how those moved people around the country. If those just are out of scope, just tell me. But I guess it was your title that led me to want to know this. But the second part is about the future, and that is the Green New Deal is now being discussed. Hundreds of political candidates have announced their commitment to it, and yet many of them know very, very little about what the heck that might be. Here in New England, we have those candidates around every state. I'm working in a coalition of doing research and then policy work with NGOs and to inform these candidates. But as we're focusing on housing, and that was the request of some of the leading sort of social justice groups in the region, they want to know, what are the policies that could address issues like you're talking about, combining issues of climate change with inequality and economic development. So, they're immediately talking about things like rent control, issues to avoid gentrification. When you invest in housing, you drive gentrification, and then that drives a new kind of segregation. So making sure there's affordability efforts built in right from the beginning, building standards, upgrading of housing, but also public housing stuff. So if you don't want to talk about any of this, just say, I don't want to talk about it, but just to get back to your title, I'm hoping you might.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I think you're absolutely right to kind of broaden the scope, kind of historically and theoretically about what else was going on in the New Deal. I mean, the most immediate things are the things kind of you mentioned. We were building public housing that was segregated as well. Highways were kind of used to segregate by creating borders, but also creating pathways for white homeowners to avoid communities of color. They were used to kind of displace certain communities. The jobs picture is something I don't know a ton about. My understanding is that there are some historians that argue that the New Deal was the start of a tipping. It was the start of the migration of African Americans into the Democratic Party because of the wide range of social benefits provided by FDR. But at the same time, we had these enormous racist housing policies. Social Security is another famous example that implicitly excluded African Americans by barring agricultural and domestic workers from participating in Social Security, which was about 80% of the African American workforce at the time. Ira Katz-Nelson has written, I guess, 2 books now on, when affirmative action was white and fear itself? Yeah, right. On the kind of these bigger picture things. Thinking about the Green New Deal is really interesting. I remember when, after Barack Obama had been elected, but before he had taken office, there was, when he was talking about pitching his stimulus package, there was a Time magazine cover that superimposed his photo onto this famous photo of FDR, and the title of that issue was The New Deal. And there were a lot of people in the kind of racial justice world, broadly speaking, kind of raising some alarms. It's like, hold on, like there were really important and meaningful parts of the New Deal that were awful for people of color a century later. So I'm glad that there are now conversations again, kind of linking this history of federal driving these inequalities in connecting it to climate change. One kind of place that I often go to is thinking about what George Romney tried to do with HUD before Nixon fired him. And he outlined a program that, what was the name? I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was going to cut federal funding for cities and states that encourage segregation. It was going to provide mortgages for African Americans in white neighborhoods and build public housing in white suburban communities. And perhaps most importantly, it was going to allow the federal government to override local zoning decisions. And I think that last one is really the biggest piece. That all of this today, and I'm sure maybe there's another paper to be written about how once redlining was declared illegal, local zoning took over, and so that's why we haven't seen any change since. And there are a couple papers connecting these kind of local housing policy decisions to segregation by race and segregation by income. And I think that's one place where you could get a tremendous amount of leverage, but the politics are a disaster. A disaster. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation, man. I had two quick questions. The first is about these, I almost want the nerd in me wants to call these incredible HOLC cities, right? And so in the aggregate, I think the big picture is really convincing. But from what you've been looking at, does an incredible HOLC city in Georgia look more similar to an incredible HOLC city in the north, or to a non-incredible HOLC city still within Georgia? And so, really segregation and racism more broadly tastes and feels and looks different across the country. Right. And so if this pattern is true, the big level and a more localized level, is Atlanta more similar to Savannah, or is it more similar to Boston? And the second part is, in a lot of these presentations, I've heard this fact about something close to or fewer than 1% of black folks got these government loans. But who were they? And what happened with them? Because my guess is it wasn't randomly distributed. And it makes me think of places, you mentioned Miami a few times, which is where I grew up. Richmond Heights looks very different than Overtown, which is aptly named for the same FHA policies that you were referencing earlier about how to build a highway. And Richmond Heights is Richmond Heights because of some government investing in a black working class community and not investing in another. And so could you speak about that 1%? Is anybody working on that, or where are these people?
I'm not working on that, but that sounds like a great series of dissertations as well. This is a not great answer to your first question, which I think is a really good one. Just looking at regional heterogeneity, showing that there isn't a huge kind of story here that I see about regional differences in the magnitude of HOLC's effect. But I think that still is kind of masking the nuance behind your kind of feel question. All of the three measures that I use have a million different limitations, including the fact that they're aspatial, the fact that they are not taking into account things like housing stock or proximity to highways or parks or anything like that. So it would be interesting to do a kind of more nuanced kind of, this is not the right word, but kind of amenity focused version of this to kind of come down from the place level to see what the effect is. And this is some of what that group of economists at the Federal Reserve of Chicago did, was that they showed that kind of housing stock, housing prices did face kind of long-term consequences from these as well, but certainly a lot more to do.
So we have Paramount and then Mark.
Like many other people in this room, I'll to reiterate this talk, so thank you so much for it. I have questions that kind of related to a kind of series of questions that you got towards the beginning, which was about mechanisms. And I wonder whether there is a kind of potential underexplored, but I mean, it's not a criticism, but it's more just like, we know that institutionalization matters. So this is to your point really about also, that what should the state just come out of it and say, we do nothing, or how much does the state coming in to legitimize what might have anyway been happening more informally? How does that matter? So I feel as if like the kind of key thing here is about, you're not at all, you're not in a way disagreeing that much of this might have been happening prior to what you're studying. But there's something about the state coming in, and I come to this more as a kind of student of comparative politics, and so, we know that, for instance, racial categorization on the census, ethnic categorization on the census has long-term, deep consequences to the ways in which people self-identify and the way in which ethnic divides get deepened. And so I wonder if there's a kind of similar story here in which, maybe this is happening across the board informally, but what does the state coming in do exactly? And so maybe it does, like, what you're saying it does, which is that those are the kind of standard ways of thinking about it, but maybe more cognitively, what the state coming in does is that suddenly all this that was happening continues to happen in terms of the material consequences, but now there's an additional cognitive mechanism by which this is not just what is happening, this is okay.
Yeah.
This comes with the weight of the state behind it. So there's a kind of certain legitimacy to these practices, which then kind of deepen divides, like confirm stereotypes, and that then has these kind of long-term consequences for preferences, attitudes, and then down the line segregation. So I'm just wondering if there's that kind of institutionalization mechanism, in addition to the kind of material consequences mechanism that could, in a way, just enrich what I think is a quite convincing empirical story.
Yeah, I would just say two things. One is that I would push a little further, and say that not only does the state coming in say that this is okay, it says this is necessary, right? That again, that you have to segregate in order to get this financing, which is one step further from like it's okay if you discriminate. No, you actually must discriminate in order for your house to appreciate and value. The one kind of interesting thing that the state coming in did that Nathan Conley argues is that HOLC was kind of the creation of the appraisal profession. And so, the kind of way that this now new actor in the housing market has a kind of standardized kind of way of evaluating neighborhoods is an interesting kind of institutional pathway through which this occurs. So maybe there are just more of these people kind of navigating and working hand in hand with mortgage lenders and real estate brokers and development councils in cities where HOLC hired all these people, and so maybe that's kind of what is going on here,
So
part of what's going on.
Creating a whole profession.
Yes. Yeah.
As an additional mechanism.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Well, Mark, it's the last question.
Which builds on enough right on where this conversation ended up. So again, I'd like to thank you for this great presentation. It's been very thought-provoking. I want to end with the role of real estate professionals. So listening to this, I'm thinking a few things to myself. The first one is 40% of national wealth is held in the housing stock, and that's largely invariant across time. You know that 1 in 10 of these things is underwater, which creates and I know there's going to be a bailout. So I mean, imagine sort of 2008 logic being played here. All I need to do is figure out who's getting bailed out and who's not. So essentially the real estate industry, however you describe that, growth of a profession, a la land grab or whatever, right? That there's a bunch of people who can make some serious cash here.
Yeah.
You gave the example earlier of redlining producing cheaper assets. But you wouldn't want to buy those because the upside's limited because you can't mortgage them. But what I'm really interested in is the other side. So on the other side of the 8 Mile fence, what happens to the price of those properties? Could it be the case that the largest, so if I'm a speculator, right, I want to have optionality on that side of the fence. And if I can get that, whether it's through holding key properties or whatever, if I redline here, the price goes up here, your C's and D's become much more valuable. I want to hold as much C and D as possible. So is there a way to be, I know, of course the data to do this will not exist, but imagine a world in which it did, right?
Yeah.
If you could actually estimate the kind of expected price differential and realized price differential pre and post, right? That could be at least an indicator, if not a driver, of your HOLC effect. Right? So that could be one way of thinking about it. So the bigger the bang on the increase in the C's and the B's, the more likely it is that that's going to be part of the explanation, or the total explanation of the differential between the HOLC and the non-HOLC, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Just, that's what occurred to me.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea, and I think it's right. I think one wrinkle that I would add is that, and I kind of somewhat mistakenly framed a lot of my presentation in this way, but there's a kind of false narrative that land in D neighborhoods was not profitable. So, because if you look at, and I should add this to the talk, if you look at Manhattan, basically the entire island of Manhattan was redlined. With a few exceptions. I mean, there were some places with too many blacks, some places with too many Italians, etc. But the way you framed it was, you don't want to buy in a red neighborhood because you can't sell it. That might be true, but if the person living there has to sell at a loss or gets foreclosed, you can now buy on X cents on the dollar.
Right.
And turn it into a rental property.
Right. Yeah.
And so this is, again, Nathan Conley's book talks a lot about how D grades were used to then kind of constrain housing markets in many of these cities.
Captive renters on one
yes,
side.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So you're creating two different.
You have captive renters whose wealth has been destroyed.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And now because of Jim Crow can't leave.
Right, can't leave, exactly.
Yeah.
Which could boost the values of the C's and the B's even further by the very fact of doing that.
Yes. And that's the blockbusting story. Right.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.